morning, church. What a morning it is indeed. Is it really good? Some of you are asking yourself, right? With the daylight savings, but I am thrilled that you're here and glad you're joining us this morning. I don't know if you knew this or if you even cared, but last Sunday was the Oscars ceremony for the movies, right? Truth be told, I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to Hollywood ceremonies. But if there is a story that I like seeing or that I enjoy being produced or created, I might tune in. Honestly, I didn't watch the Oscars this year as I heard many of the films destined to win they're just really, honestly, I fundamentally disagree with almost everything that their plot is about. But, except for one, and that was Dune 2. And I can tell by your reaction, you weren't super thrilled about that one either. And I think I know why. Here's why. Because when Dune Part 1 came out in the movies, my sister actually went to go see it, my older sister with her husband. And so my brother-in-law, he knew nothing about the film. My sister, I think, has read every book in the series, which is saying something, because if you know the Dune series, the first book is a novel. It's like reading the Bible back to back, but cover to cover. But so she's read everything. He's never seen it. No surprise. Each of them walked away from the movie with very different opinions. My sister thought it was the most amazing sci-fi movie she had ever seen in the past 10 years. And my brother-in-law hated it. He said, that movie was so long, I thought it would never end. And my sister said, that's just part one. They're just getting started. He says, are you kidding me? They're going to make another film about nothing again? How can they do this? And as you listen to the reviews about the movie, what you start realizing is that the people who love it the most actually read the book. And the people who didn't read the book were extremely lost and confused about what was going on. So for those of you who are visiting for the first time, we are going through a series called The Story. And in many ways, what we are reading this past week, or what we've read this past week in The Story, chapter 9 of The Story, it makes a whole lot more sense when you know the backstory to it all. And the reason why is because it's the book of Ruth. And in the book of Ruth, there are some strange things that take place culturally that you're kind of like, what in the world is going on here? There's feet being uncovered. There's kinsmen redeemers. There's cloaks being thrown over people. There's gleaning in the field. There's threshing floors and land to be redeemed. And I think it all could be a little confusing without a little bit of the backstory. So what I want to do with you this morning is give you a little bit of that. And I think what it will do is I think it will help us all appreciate the incredible story, the incredible journey, really, of Ruth and Naomi. And my hope also is that we all will appreciate what God is trying to tell us about how he feels about each and every one of us through this story of faith, the faith of a foreign woman named Ruth. For those of you who were here last weekend, we went through the book of Judges in chapter 8. That would be chapter 8. And this story takes place during the time of the judges. And some scholars believe it was during the time of the judge named Gideon, for those of you who remember that story. Regardless, though, we're not really sure for sure, but regardless, we learned last weekend about the promised land cycle of Israel, where Israel, during the time that they were taking over the promised land in the book of Judges, they would follow God as long as they had a judge who would lead them. And as soon as the judge would die, the Israelites would become wicked, and they would go off into their own ways. They'd worship idols. They'd worship other gods. And God would punish them for this wickedness. And he'd let another nation come in, and this other nation would either oppress them, enslave them, or conquer them in some way. They would get fed up with it. They would finally repent. They would cry out to God, and God would raise up another judge, and they become righteous again. They'd follow and be faithful to God again. So this story that we're in the book of Ruth is probably taking place when Israel is worshiping some foreign gods, and God was most likely at this time punishing them for this idol worship with a famine. The story starts out like this in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and so a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Again, a little background to the story I think is needed. When the Israelites finally went into the promised land, I'm going to back up just a little bit in their story. When they finally went into the promised land, those who've been following along, you know the story. God rescues Israelites from Egyptian slavery. He brings them right up to the edge of the promised land. The Israelites at the time said, we can't take it. They were afraid to take what God wanted to give them. As a punishment for not taking what God wanted to give, they wander around in the desert for 40 years until that wicked generation died. And a new generation was raised up who would take what God wanted to give them in the promised land. They get up to the promised land. Moses has died. That wicked generation has died. And now Joshua is going to lead them into the promised land. And when Joshua leads them into the promised land and he finally conquers the nations, most of them, and they're about to take over the land and live there, what he does is Joshua divided up the land between 12 of the tribes, so each tribe would have a portion of the land. I'm not sure that everybody knew that. And so it looks something like this. I'll show you on a map. So this is kind of how it was broken up, right? Chapter 9 starts out by telling us that the 2 main characters, Elimelech and his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons, they were from a town called Bethlehem. Ever heard of it? Go ahead and go to the next slide. I know it doesn't look like much, but you can see that red circle. That's where Bethlehem is, right? This means that they were from Bethlehem. That means that they are from the tribe of Judah. They were given land as their inheritance, just like every other Israelite was in that place. It was their inheritance. We'll talk more about that more in a minute. But things must have been pretty bad in Israel for Elimelech and his family to sell their land and move to a place called Moab. That's where they moved to. Now, selling your land that you inherited during the promised land time that Joshua gave it to you, that you would have been desperate to sell your land in that time. Very desperate. It was a desperate move. But an even more desperate move was to move to Moab. I'll tell you a little bit about Moab. Moab is about 50 to 75 miles away from Bethlehem. Traveling there would have taken them about 7 to 10 days. And they must have been desperate because Moab was actually one of Israel's foreign enemies. They were created from a terrible, terrible beginning of an incestuous relationship between Abraham's nephew and his nephew Lot and his 2 daughters, Lot's 2 daughters. And when the Israelites first leave Egypt, they actually, you read in chapter 6 of the story, that the men of Israel actually indulged in sexual immorality with the Moab or Moabite women there. And just last weekend, we read about Ehud. He's a judge. He killed the very fat Moabite king, Eglon is his name, and he lost his sword, left-handed, lost his sword in the fat of the king he stabbed it in so far. Pretty gross, but it's very memorable, right? You guys remember that story. This is the Moab that they travel to. They have a lot of run-ins with Moab. So they must have been very desperate in this time of famine to move to Moab. Now, I have been to Moab, Utah, before. And I'll just tell you, it's completely different. But it does make sense now to me why their sons would find wives in a place named Moab. One son marries Orpah, and the other son marries a Moabite woman named Ruth. And that leads me to the very first thing that I want you to understand about the story of Ruth, and that is Ruth's story of deliverance is actually born out of disobedience. Not only did this family suffer hardship with a famine because of the whole nation's sin and disobedience, but Elimelech then moved his family to an enemy nation and allowed his boys to marry these foreign women, which was in direct conflict with God's law and God's word. Now, this is not a commentary right now. I want you to understand what I'm about to say is not a commentary today about interracial marriage or anything like that, okay? We're not talking about that today. This was for them back then, and the reason why is that God didn't want them marrying foreign women or foreign men or women if you were one or the other, okay? Other issues with that we don't need to talk about this morning, but he didn't want them marrying foreign people because they would be tempted to worship the gods of those foreign people. And guess what? He was right. So God says, don't do it. Don't do it. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 7. I'll just show you real quick. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, he says, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. But Elimelech there, he knows this about God and what his rules and his laws are, but he still allows his boys to marry these foreign women anyways. And we find out that while in Moab, right? While in Moab, Elimelech dies, his two boys die. Naomi, who is Elimelech's wife, is left with her two foreign daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. And Naomi, so unsurprisingly here, is absolutely heartbroken. And she is probably at the lowest point in her life that she's ever been. She has been trying to scrape by during a famine as best as she can. Her husband dies. Both of her boys die. What conclusion would you come to if you were in her situation? She tells her daughter-in-laws to leave and go back to the Moabite town so they can find some other Moabite men, someone else in their own tribe to marry. In those days, for those who don't know, if you were a woman without a connection to a man in some way, you truly were a destitute person, and you were out of options, really. You were in a bad place. And so she tells them, leave me, go find someone else to marry. Well, Orpah, she weeps, but in the end, she takes her mother-in-law's advice, and she leaves, and she finds a man, tries to find a man in Moab. But Ruth, she still weeps as well, but Ruth stays. Ruth is literally Naomi's enemy. She's a Moabite. And it's not just because, she's not an enemy just because, that's her mother-in-law, right? I know most people are in tears having to see their mother-in-law, not having to leave their mother-in-law. But Ruth is in tears having to leave her mother-in-law. She's an enemy. She's a Moabite. Literally, her people are the enemies of Israel. They worship the god Chemosh, the Moabite god of protection and provision. But Ruth instead makes her famous statement, and I'm so glad for whoever changed that this morning. I have an idea who it was. But she says this beautiful, beautiful oath. And it's on the screen over here to my right as well. Ruth 1:16. She says to Naomi, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Isn't that just such beautiful poetic verse there? To be honest, Ruth should have left Naomi. She should have. Naomi was older, and it would not be Naomi taking care of Ruth, but rather it would be Ruth taking care of Naomi. Ruth loves Naomi so much, she doesn't even want death to separate them. And Ruth is the enemy, which really leads to my first takeaway for you this morning of chapter 9, and that is Ruth's story of deliverance gives us a lot of hope because there are people who believe that their lives are too bad to belong. Ruth is a Moabite and a foreigner, and the interesting thing to me is that the author of Ruth, they won't let us forget it. In the book of Ruth, I counted 9 times in 4 chapters that the author reminds us that she is a foreign woman. She doesn't belong. A foreigner who doesn't belong, a foreign woman who was an enemy by birth, a foreign woman who has no rights. It keeps going on and on. And you say, what's your point, Jeff? My point is that the author seems to have one primary agenda here. He is not concerned about condemning the father for moving to Moab. He's not concerned about that. He's not concerned about judging the sons for marrying a foreign woman. He's not concerned about that. He does not comment on Orpah, who's another foreigner, going back to her gods. He's not commenting on that. He's not concerned with the theology of declaring the uniqueness of God. He's not concerned with any of those things. He seems to be interested in getting one major point across, and it's this: whether it is right and good to allow a foreign woman into the community of Israel through marriage. That's what he's concerned about. Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. So if you didn't read. So it's important to understand that even though Ruth's story was born out of disobedience, it does not condone disobedience. It doesn't really even comment on it, is what the point I'm trying to make is. But rather, the book of Ruth is dead set to show us the grace of God wants to include people who don't belong. Later on in Scripture, the prophet Isaiah will write this about foreigners and the enemies of Israel. Isaiah 56:3 says this: "Let no foreigner who has bound himself to the Lord say, 'The Lord will surely exclude me from his people.'" No foreigner should say that if they've bound themselves to God. Ruth says to Naomi, "Let your people be my people, and let your God be my God." And I believe the application today for us is simply this: anyone who walks through those doors and says the same thing, that they want our God to be their God, we should not exclude. I don't care if they're Muslim or Jewish or gay or straight or an alcoholic or a workaholic or black or white or Democrat, Libertarian or Republican. I don't care. No one is too bad. No one is too foreign. No one is too anything to be touched by the grace of God and belong to his community of believers. Anyone who wants God to be their God, we should not make it difficult for them to belong here. Does that mean, Jeb, preacher, you're telling me they don't have to change at all? No, I'm not saying that. Encountering the real Jesus actually changes people. And it takes time. But they can't even have a fighting chance of knowing him if they have to be perfect when they walk through those doors. And so it makes me ask the question, is CK a safe place for us to bring our friends and our co-workers from Moab? Is CK a place that God can use to bring outsiders into his family? Or will we only love those who are like us? I believe this story is challenging to us, church, because the story of Ruth teaches us to love those who believe that they are too bad to belong. But what about Naomi? What a woman. She loved her daughter-in-laws. She loved them so well that they don't even want to leave her. They're weeping to have the thought of leaving her. Naomi, and some of you are like this, Naomi loved hard, but she didn't always believe that God loved her. I appreciate that song this morning. You're a good, good father. She didn't believe all of that she was loved by God. See, the story of Naomi, I think, reminds us that there are people who believe their lives are too bitter for God to make beautiful. Famine and starvation, moving from your people and homeland, the death of a spouse, death of children, and the crazy thing is, God is actually hardly mentioned at all in Ruth. Did you notice that? He's hardly mentioned at all. He hardly gets much credit at all. But he is there. God has hidden himself in the story of Ruth. But if you went through what Naomi went through, you might say some of the same words about God that she said. In Ruth 1, verse 20, She said, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." And so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Naomi's name, for those who don't know, is translated, or it means beautiful. Naomi's name means beautiful. And she had a beautiful life living in Bethlehem. Bethlehem means bread. She was full in Bethlehem, but she came back from her journey, she says, empty. And as she journeyed back home, she thought the will for God's life, the will of God for her life was to be destitute and empty for the rest of her life. But as she journeyed back home, and she thought God had forsaken her, that she would always be empty. But like I said, God hid himself. God was right there with her the whole time. Because you know who traveled home with her? Ruth. And do you know what Ruth's name means? Ruth's name means satisfied. And through Ruth, God was going to provide and satisfy the emptiness of both Ruth and Naomi beyond anything they could have imagined. So it's hard for me not to see my mom's story in all of this, and I do apologize for long-time and long-term members here, because I think I use her story a lot, and you've heard it a lot. But for those who may be new or haven't heard the story before, and you don't know, my dad passed away when I was 2 years old. My mom was left behind to be the main breadwinner for 2 kids, me and my older sister. My mother has told me some of the stories of the days before my dad died. He had a heart attack, and he was actually resuscitated, and he was on life support for a year in the hospital. One day, she almost got fired from her job just to visit my dad in the hospital. The doctors had called her at work because they thought that, he was coding, and they thought he might not be around any longer, thought he might die. She asked her boss if she could leave, and her boss said, "You can't leave without your shift being covered." Well, she basically told him some words and said, "I'm leaving anyways." And she went to go visit him that day, and she didn't know if she'd have a job when she returned. One day the power went out at the hospital, and since my dad was on life support, they had to find battery backup. This is kind of before they really thought ahead, I think, of some of this stuff. And they found a battery, was able to put the life support on, battery backup, and hoped that the power would come back on before it ran out. Eventually, though, my dad passed away. It was, again, about a year that he was on life support. And after he passed, Mom was working hard hours, long hours, long days, trying to make ends meet, trying to make it so that me and my sister would have food to eat. And you know how much I like to eat, so, she had to work a lot for that. But not to mention also just, keeping the lights on, the mortgage paid. She told me that her income never matched the bills that she had to pay. They were bitter times for my mother. They were the worst of times, if you will. And yet my mother always reminded me of this verse, and she would quote it, but this is the verse, Psalm 68. His name is the Lord, Father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling. And you know what? She never lost her job, even though she left. Even though she went to visit him that one day. She did eventually change jobs, but she didn't lose her job that day. Somehow the bills were paid. She says, "I don't know how it happened. I don't know how the bills got paid," but somehow the bills got paid. Sometimes when she would get her checkbook out to write the babysitter a check for watching me and my sister, she would say, "I knew that the check would bounce, and so I'd have to ask her that day." But instead of her having to ask her, our babysitter, who was a Christian woman from our church, would say, "No charge this week." Life was not easy for my mother. And she had times of bitterness. But I will tell you that my mother, when she looks back now on the situation that she was in, she always points out the hidden work of God in her life during the worst of times. God satisfied her every need when she trusted in him. And the story of Naomi reminds us that when you think God is farthest from you or has even turned against you so that your life is bitter, the truth is that he is laying a foundation of greater hope and greater happiness and greater beauty in your life. Because you see, it was God who was behind the leading of Naomi back home, and it was God who was behind Ruth choosing Boaz's field. It was God who caused the rightful next of kin to actually decline the land and not take Ruth as his own. It was God working a way to bring in someone who didn't belong in his family. And he did it through an incredible, upright man named Boaz. A man with a family history that probably was frowned upon in Israel. And I believe Boaz's story gives us hope because we know that there are people who believe their past lives are too blemished to be bold for God anymore. Ruth and Naomi hear that there's food back in Bethlehem, back in the town where they're from, her homeland. And so they travel that 50 to 75 miles back to Bethlehem. They were tired, they were destitute, and they were in desperate need of food. Now, again, some backstory to understand what's going on here in the situation. In those days, the Israelites actually had laws to tell the Israelite community how they should help their fellow poor. One of their laws said that if you owned land and you were harvesting food from that land, you had to allow the poor people to come along behind you, behind those harvesters, and let them glean, is the word they use, which is really let them pick up what was dropped and left behind from those workers who were harvesting. Leviticus 23:22 spells it out. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, meaning if it's square, leave the corners. Do not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. And then in another verse it says in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. I think it's so awesome, to me at least, how God makes provision for the poor in his laws in that time. And the point is, though, in this story, even though God made provision, it still was really dangerous to glean for poor people back in those days. If you got too close to those people who were harvesting the crop, they might turn around and yell at you and beat you and say, back off, we're not done yet, back off. Or they might take advantage of you in some other way. If you were a woman, they might take advantage of you in particular ways. It was not a pretty sight for people who were poor. It was kind of difficult at times. So this is a situation that Ruth is walking into in order to survive starvation. But it's worse for her because she's a foreigner. She's not even an Israelite. She's an enemy. She's an outsider. But God will provide for her still. And when she guessed, the field that she just happens to choose, she just happens to go, I'm going to go to this field. The field she chooses to glean in, it's none other than the man named Boaz. Boaz, as I said, is an upright and bold man. His name means strength, and more importantly, Boaz is a distant relative of Naomi. Distant. And this is important because it's important to realize out of all the fields that Ruth could have chosen, she just happens to choose the one belonging to a man who could redeem her. She just happens to do that. Like I hinted at before, in those days, women did not have much of a livelihood if they were not married, and if they weren't connected to a man or a husband in some way. They didn't have a family to take care of them. They were really destitute and in a lot of trouble. And so God makes provision for women, and the way he does this, it's strange to us, and I get it, but I'm just going to tell you like it is. What he would do is that if a husband died and they had no offspring, it was the brother of the deceased husband's privilege and responsibility to take in this destitute widow under his wing of protection. And he was supposed to marry her, he was supposed to take care of her and give her offspring so that she could actually have an inheritance. And if he couldn't do that or didn't want to do that, then the next of kin would have that opportunity to redeem her, hence the name kinsman redeemer. I hope that makes sense. And I don't really want to confuse you anymore, but I feel like I need to tell you this part. But part of that responsibility as the kinsman redeemer was also to buy back property if they had sold some. Because you see, when any Israelite sold their property at that time, it was never really a forever deal. They technically would always be allowed to acquire it back. And there was 3 ways that you could do that. One way was you could wait for every 50 years when Jubilee would roll around. Every 50 years, the property would be given back to the person who originally owned it. And so you could wait for 50 years to get your property back. And if you bought property, you would take into account, okay, 50 years from now, it's going to be given back. And so if I'm at year 25, I need to take that into account for the price I'm going to pay for it. Well, you could wait 50 years unless you sold your property the year after Jubilee. You got to wait 49 years. That's a long time. You may not be able to wait that long. And so that was one way you could get your property back. The other way is you could buy it back yourself. The last and final way is that you could, especially if you sold your land because you were too poor to keep it, you sold it because you had to live, your nearest kinsman, your next closest relative could purchase it back for you if you were too poor to do that. And God made provision for this in his law in the book of Leviticus. One more time, chapter 25, verse 25. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. This was God's law, asking them to take care of their relatives in this way. Their nearest relative would be the kinsman redeemer. I hope you get that. And so the very field that Ruth happens to choose is the field of one of these kinsman redeemers, these guardian redeemers, and his name is Boaz. And Boaz has a past in Israel. I don't know if you caught this, but a couple weeks ago when we read the genealogy of Jesus, did you catch who Boaz's mother was? Matthew 1:5, it's on the screen. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed. Spoiler alert, Ruth and Boaz get married. They have Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Rahab is Boaz's mother. Now, why is this important? I think it's an important detail because Boaz comes from a family of outsiders. Rahab was a prostitute that God allowed to be a part of the Israelite community after Joshua came in and completely destroyed her people. Before he did that, she said, I want your God to be my God. And they allowed her to be in their community. And she lived with the Israelites until that day. She has kids. She marries one of them and has kids with one of them. And the kid's name is Boaz. And God uses a man from a family of outsiders to do his work of bringing in an outsider. When we come across Boaz in the story, he's doing pretty well for himself. He has land, he's a landowner. But what impresses me even more is that we see a boy born of a prostitute who became a man with more character than most guys I know who claim to be a Christian and come from Christian families. Boaz notices the poor. He notices who's in his field. Boaz obeys the laws of God, and he allows his fields to be gleaned during a time of a famine. What an incredible guy. Boaz is kind to Ruth. He gives her grain and water when he didn't have to do that. Boaz tells his harvesting boys to not touch, don't lay a hand on Ruth, don't you touch her. Boaz allows Ruth to glean with his women who work so that no harm comes to her. Boaz finds himself woken up by Ruth on the threshing floor, completely vulnerable to him at his feet, and he doesn't let her go because he's worried that the harvest boys might harm her in some way or mistreat her. You read the story a little bit further and you find out Boaz makes sure to give the person who can rightfully claim Naomi's property before he can. He gives him first dibs on purchasing it even though he wanted it. And finally, Boaz marries a Moabite outsider, Ruth, and purchases and redeems and takes on all of Naomi's and Ruth's expenses without getting anything tangible in return. He takes it all on because, you see, God uses people with a past to do his work of helping other people belong. Just because you have a past doesn't mean that you can't be bold for God. You know, it's interesting to me that when Boaz first meets Ruth, he's impressed by her because of how she left her home, she left her people, and she starts taking care of Naomi. And Boaz says these words in Ruth 2:12, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And that is why I asked Rich to lead that song. God does take Ruth under his wings of provision and protection. But God doesn't do it miraculously. How does he do it? He does it by using Boaz. Boaz throws his cloak over her in the story as a symbol of what God is doing through him for Ruth. And I think God used Boaz because Boaz knew what it was like to be on the outside. Boaz knew what it meant to not belong. God used an outsider with a past to bring in an outsider. Boaz boldly took on all the cost. He took on all the cost to bring in a foreign enemy under his wing of protection. And 28 generations after King David, one of Ruth's offspring would take on all the cost for us. To bring in all of us foreign enemies of God under his wing of protection. 28 generations after King David, Jesus was born to redeem us. Colossians 1:21 says it beautifully. "Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation." So in closing, I don't know where you may be at with the story of Ruth, to be honest. You could be going through a time of bitterness right now. It could be the worst of times for you right now. And I believe the story of Ruth reminds us that God is still there, even if the miracles are not. You just might need to ask God for forgiveness today, this morning, because of the way that you have treated some people from Moab, whom God wants to include in his family, but whom you have pushed away because of your prejudice. You might need to do that today. You may be facing the reality that you have a broken past, you have a broken family, your family, you don't have a lot to be proud of. And you're wondering if God could ever use a person like you, a person with your history, a person with your family past. And the answer is, God can use anyone, no matter how weak or how much bad has happened in your life. He can use anyone. And maybe today you feel like you're on the outside, that you want to be a part and to belong to a bigger family. And maybe today is the day that you're baptized, that you're brought under the wings of God through his Son, Jesus Christ. And we offer that to you this morning. Whatever your need may be, won't you let us help you this morning? Won't you let us be someone who can connect you to the Lord God, our King? Won't you talk or pray with one of our elders in the front and back? Or maybe today you want to pray with our prayer team. They'll be in room 9 this morning. I'm not sure how this has touched you this morning, but I ask you to respond this morning. Perhaps today you want to be baptized. And so we offer baptism to you. You can come to the front row when the last song begins. But we want to offer that to you this morning. Be brought under the protection, under the blood, under the grace of God through Jesus Christ, through baptism this morning. Please come to the front row and respond, whatever your need may be, while we stand and sing this closing song. Please stand. Let's sing.